through a lot of stuff. Okay, so muscle function and organization, we went over that last time. Now we're going to go over muscle tissue, okay? And then the microanatomy worksheet we'll work on at the next Thursday's lesson. You can take a look at it, but you don't need to. So it wouldn't hurt to do that. And then the quiz will be open Thursday. Okay, the quiz will be open Thursday if we do Monday. All right, so in other words, the quiz is based on all the muscle material, which was from last Thursday, today, and our next class. Okay? Oh, any thoughts, any questions? Okay. So that's all right. I got questions for you guys. Now, I do want to say, hopefully everybody logged into VBox. Okay? I noticed that quite often I don't get really good participation with this. I don't like that. Okay? You're not getting a grade on the VBox thing, but I do expect you to give it a good old college try to answer the question. Because even if you don't understand it, even if you get the question wrong, you know, it tells me, oops, I have to go over it again, or whatever, you know, that there's an issue here, okay? So I'm going to ask you to please answer the VBox questions. In fact, what I plan to do is take a quick scan and see. If you don't do it, you're not going to get credit for the quiz, okay? So let me make that clear. You're not getting graded for the VBox, but if you don't even do it, I'm not going to give you credit for the quiz when the quiz is due. Okay? Any questions you've got? But you have to do the VBox in class in order to get credit for the take-home quiz. Okay? It's just an incentive for you to go ahead and do it, and that's the login for it. All right. I guess I have to do this again. Issue. Okay. Okay, so let's see if we can get that first question up here. Okay. Let's see what you got, guys. So if you were here the last time, Thursday, I had a similar question, but the wording was a little confusing. Hopefully this is a little bit more straightforward. Go back there. 17, better get one in 17. "25 people, 20 answers. 1, 2, maybe a few more seconds. 3. Okay, so let me show you what we got here. I only have 23 answers, by the way, so okay, if you're having trouble, let me know after class because it's important. Okay, let's see what the poll says. Okay, can you guys see the responses here? We've got about 50% A and 50% C. Okay? All right. Forcibly contract. Who said yes? Yeah, right? Yes, come on, that's what muscles do, they contract. Okay? Forcibly expand. What? I don't know any better way. If anybody can come up with a better way to say it, this is a misdirect. In other words, it's not true. Forcibly expand. A muscle can't forcibly expand. Now again, let me go over the analogy again. Okay. If you have take the arm muscle, for example, okay, the upper arm. That's a curling kind of motion, that's a bicep is contracting. And the tricep, so here's a bone, here's the joint, okay? And so this is contracting, right? The muscle here is pulling on from here to here. You see that? Okay, that's a contraction. Now, if you need to go the other way, so if I'm kind of a pushing motion, right? Where I'm pushing that way, I'm exerting force that way. Well, you have a muscle on this side which has a tendon that comes all the way around to here. You see, it comes around that joint, and when this contracts, it pushes the muscle forward. But in every case, force is only exerted by muscles contracting. Okay, we got it? No? Okay, come on guys, this is your chance to ask a question if you're unclear there. Okay, so the muscles are acting kind of in a complementary pair. Yeah?
So when this contracts, this doesn't expand or something?
It expands, but it doesn't forcibly expand. Okay, it's passively expanding. So maybe that's the confusion. Is that it? That's what's the problem? I don't know any other way to I'm trying to think of another way. You know, it cannot forcibly expand. You can't push, if you will, a muscle, right? It can only contract. It's trying to think. So kind of like a stretched out rubber band. It can contract. Okay, but it can't go the other way on its own. Still a little shaky on that? Okay. All right, let's keep moving. So muscles have certain properties, okay, which makes them, many of these make it somewhat unique from other tissues, say adipose tissue or, dermis, right? So it's excitable. In other words, it responds to an electrical signal. This is a relatively unique thing, okay? Response to electrical signal. If you ever seen back in the old days the movies of Galvani, he had a well, you guys may have done this in lab. He had a frog muscle hooked up to in between two poles there, and you would touch it with a battery, and the muscle would contract. And that was like, wow, what is going on? How does electricity have to do with muscles? And this is amazing. But we now know that muscles are excitable. They do respond to electrical and chemical signals. Okay, and chemical signals are called neurotransmitters. They're conductive. One part of a muscle fiber, a myofiber, one part of a fiber is stimulated, the pulse goes down, the excitability goes throughout the entire fiber. So everything in that fiber reacts. Okay, it's conductivity. Contractility we already know. Okay, it can contract. Only contractility. And then the word that the book uses is extensible. That means it can be passively stretched out again. Okay, you might call that relaxing. All right, any questions about that? All right. So what I'm going to try to do, because this is, it has two choices I have. Either rush through it and get done on time, and lose half the class, or take my time, make sure that you're kind of following, and then we don't finish everything in two classes. I'm going to take that option. What that means, though, is that there may be a little tail end of this that I'm going to have to record for you to watch on your own. All right, so we already talked about this muscle contractility. Okay? The thing is, how the muscle fibers shorten, and this is you've got to really kind of, I really encourage you to make sure you understand the terms so that you can see how it does make sense. The muscle fiber, or myofibril, is a cell. It runs from end to end of the muscle, but that thing does contract. Obviously it does, right? It has to. Okay. And you remember our conservation of energy, right? Conservation of energy says whenever energy is utilized, it has to come from somewhere. So that's a good thing to remember. You know, I always see, like, if I see something like a clock that, you know, looks like it's working on its own, it doesn't have any external electrical supply. No. It's got to have some kind of electrical supply. Maybe it's sunlight. But here it's the same thing. For muscle to move, for that kinetic energy to be manifest, it has to get the energy from somewhere. Where does it get it? From the potential energy in ATP, from the chemical bonds that are released. The energy released when an ATP breaks down. So there's a lot, we can study ATP at a molecular level, but it's enough to kind of think of it as being a storage form of energy, almost like a battery, okay, for all practical purposes. Obviously, that's just a crude analogy. Now, we have different muscle types, and we're not going to spend a lot of time on non-skeletal muscle, but I just briefly wanted to mention it. We have cardiac muscle, which is shown here in the middle, and then smooth muscle, which is shown on your right, on the right hip. And so, cardiac, smooth muscle. And the main thing that differentiates them microscopically, now this is like, you wouldn't be able to see this with the naked eye, but a good optical microscope. I have here 400 times magnification, you don't have to remember that. But what you see, what's characteristic of skeletal muscle are these striations, okay? These striations, okay? So here's a muscle fiber, one fiber, here's another fiber, here's another fiber, and running across the fibers, okay, one after the other, are these striations. So the striations, sometimes it's called striated muscle, all right? And that's the same, used interchangeably with skeletal muscle. Okay? And this is voluntary muscle. Okay, skeletal muscle is voluntary. You can decide when you want to activate it. Okay, so ultimately, the neurons that innervate it come from ultimately from the brain, right? Whereas smooth muscle and cardiac muscle, it works on its own. It's involuntary. So this is just showing you the striations. Remember, here's a muscle fiber, okay, going this way. Muscle fibers are arranged horizontally here. Here's one fiber, another fiber, another fiber, another fiber. They're all parallel to each other. And running across is this striation. We're gonna go into the details of the striation, but it's at least enough for you to know how it looks. And here are the nuclei for a nucleus for a muscle fiber. So this is a cell, this is a cell. It's unbelievable to me. I remember when I first looked at this, I thought, that can't be an individual cell. It's so complicated. We haven't got to the electron micrograph yet, but it's very complicated. Okay, so just to finish up the involuntary muscle, okay, cardiac is what we use, is what keeps your heart going. And that's fascinating because that muscle, as you've heard me say before, is what we call automatic. It goes all by itself. You take the heart out, and as long as it's getting enough nutrients, it will beat all by itself. So that's why sometimes when people have really bad head trauma, their heart can still keep beating all by itself. What you have to do is have respiration, because if you have an injury with it, you don't get signals to your phrenic nerve in your lungs, then you won't breathe and you'll die that way. Okay, so then we had smooth muscle, like blood vessels contract. Sometimes if you've ever been out when it's cold and your hair on your skin sticks up, that's another smooth muscle kind of thing. Okay, and neither one of these have those clear striations that you see in the skeletal muscle. And the involuntary muscle is controlled by the involuntary nervous system. That's what it's called. You know, if you break down the nervous system in general into voluntary and involuntary, or somatic, sometimes called somatic is voluntary, and autonomic, not automatic, autonomic. Autonomic. That's the kind of the involuntary nervous system. And we're going to be talking about those in detail for exam 4, or defining same thing. Okay, so again, skeletal muscle attached to bones, has striations, works voluntarily, part of the somatic nervous system. Now, one thing that has always thrown me, and I kind of avoided it in the past, but I think that's kind of cheating. I just wanted to touch on it, hopefully not confuse you. We do have, not everything is so cut and dry. You know, voluntary, involuntary, striated, non-striated. We have parts of our being that are somewhere in between, and sphincters are an example. Sphincters are circular, okay? And so, like anal sphincter, right, urethra, where urethral sphincter, where they open and close voluntarily. Obviously, you decide when you have to go to, when you feel like you have to go to the bathroom, but you have some say over it, right? So those sphincters are under voluntary control, but yet they're smooth muscle. It's kind of confusing. Sphincters are a combination of smooth muscle and striated muscle. Okay? We're not going to talk about them in detail, but you should just be aware that they exist. And some of them are strictly. Let me leave it at that. Okay, are we good on that? Nobody likes to ask questions. Okay, so again, muscle fibers. Now, forgive me, I know sometimes I use myofiber and muscle fibers interchangeably. Maybe I shouldn't, but then again, that's the way it is in the real world, so you might as well get used to it. A muscle fiber is one cell, okay? Single mature cell runs the length of the muscle. In other words, let's say, again, you know, we have our friend the bicep, right? It's actually a bunch of these little fibers in there, okay? A bunch of the individual fibers. So one cell runs from one part all the way to the other, okay? And it can be up to 30 centimeters long, 30 centimeters long is long. Muscle fibers don't generally undergo cell division, okay? That's kind of unusual. So you might wonder, especially our exercise science guys, how is it that, you know, Arnold Schwarzenegger really looks like he's got more muscle fibers than other people, right? Anybody want to take a guess? You guys in back? If the muscle fibers themselves don't undergo cell division, how does it that you build muscle? Not yet? Okay, we'll talk about it as we go on. But they don't undergo cell division. So if a muscle is damaged, you know, quite often it can remain that way. Okay, they're multinucleated. Okay, that's just a fact, but I don't really know if it has much consequence. And they do contain, muscle fibers do contain glycogen. Those of you, hopefully, who were here last time we talked about diabetes. By the way, what I plan to do, my little digression onto diabetes, I know it's like, hey, what does that have to do with the topic? So what I'll do is I'll make that an option for the extra credit on the next exam. So compare and contrast type 1, type 2 diabetes. Okay, so if you don't, this is one of those things. You got to choose your battles. You know, if you think, hey, I don't want to go there, then don't. But if you feel like, yeah, my Uncle John has type 2 diabetes, let me take the time and learn about it, and I'll get an extra credit. That's going to be one of the options for an extra credit. All right, but anyway, the muscles, whether you know about diabetes or not, are very important in control of glucose and sugar levels, and they contain the storage form of glucose called glycogen. The other important thing is muscle contains this thing called myoglobin, which is like hemoglobin, but a little different, and it's specific to the muscle. Okay? So if you were to find myoglobin in the urine, okay, what pathology would myoglobin in the urine suggest? It tells you there's muscle damage. So somebody really, had a severe crushing kind of an injury to a limb, you might find myoglobin in the urine. So they'll do a test. For example, let's say a physician thinks you have a degenerative muscle disease. They might look for myoglobin in the urine, okay? It would show you the muscle wasting or muscle breakdown. Okay. Get a new question here. I think we're going to go and do real well on this one. Oh, 24 responses already. Wonderful, wonderful. Let's see here. Stop. Okay, so as you can see, everybody picked D, that's right. Very good. The next one. And our muscles do whatever. This is what happens when I'm not really, I just throw something together. This would be like several individual muscles line up end to end. So what I'm asking is, do they go this way? Something like that? Is that the way the muscle cells are, or is it just one long muscle? So. Okay, see, I confused everybody, yeah, because everybody's putting number one. Okay. All right. Clearly, we said they don't replicate. That's good. Nobody's picked that. They contain myoglobin, not hemoglobin. And then a lot of people, I think, are thinking that I wasn't very clear with that first part. I'll try to be more careful when I ask the question on the exam. But what I'm asking is, are there chain of them lined up from one end to end of the muscle, or is it one muscle fiber from one end to the other? And it's not a chain, it's not a sequence of cells, it's one cell that stretches from the origin to the insertion. Okay, we're good? Yeah. Okay.
So the answer to that one was?
Yeah, so the answer to that would be D. Okay, would be D. We're good. And the answer to the other one would be D as well. Okay. Again, guys, because this happens a lot, if somebody on the exam says, well, you asked a question in class and what the answer was. I follow when it's confusing that the questions are asked a little differently, but by the same token, your job is to understand the concept behind it more than just, okay, if I see that question, I kind of reflexively put A and B. Okay, so if you're not sure what I'm asking, even after I explain it, come and talk to me. Because I just don't accept that when somebody contests an exam question because they think they saw something like that had a different answer somewhere else. Okay, myofibrils. All right, so now this is where it really gets complicated. And believe me, I'm trying to just torture you guys to the minimal that I think is necessary to honestly teach the material. So we have these fibers. Myofiber is a, what, somebody help me. Madeline, what's a myofiber is? Starts with a C, ends with an L, has an EL.
Oh, cell.
It's a cell, okay? It's a cell. Myofiber is one cell, okay? Now, so we're good there, right? Believe it or not, in that, I'll get back to the other slide. It's always hard to know which to put the explanation of the picture first. I think we'll go with the picture. Okay, this is a myofiber. That is one cell. I can't, it boggles my mind. See, up there on the right it says muscle fiber. That's a fiber. Okay, the whole thing is a fiber. Okay, so now we start getting into the details of the fiber. Within the fiber, okay, are again these little sub-packages called, I have to make sure I'm right myself because I forget, myofibrils. Okay, so these units here are myofibrils. Okay, so why are the myofibrils important? Because that unit is surrounded by this network, which is called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. I'll get to that in another slide that shows that better. But you have myofibrils. And inside these myofibrils is yet another level, the ultimate level of detail. And that's called the myofilaments. The myofilaments, those are really what's kind of causing, those are the workhorses, if you will, the myofilaments. And you see, even looking at these, you see that there's two different kinds, okay? So what did we have that illustrated here? This is a muscle fiber. The whole thing is a single cell, okay? What else was there that I'm pointing out? The myofibril, and then the filaments within the fibril. Okay, let me make sure I didn't miss anything here. Okay, each muscle fiber contains myofibrils. Myofibrils contain the filaments, molecular workhorses, and then there are two kinds of filaments, thick and thin. So we go from muscle to muscle fascicle to fiber, cell, right? That's a cell, and fibril and filaments. And then we have this thing called the sarcoplasmic reticulum, which surrounds each one of the myofibrils and contains calcium. So just do your best, guys. I know this is really tricky. Okay, but this is another view of the same cell. Okay, myofiber cell. Here it's a little more clear that around each one of these packages, okay, is a sarcoplasmic reticulum. And then we have these thick and thin filaments. Around each one of the fibrils is a sarcoplasmic reticulum that contains calcium. That's very important because calcium release is what triggers a contraction. So we're going to get to that in a minute. But you have these filaments are the smallest level, and those filaments are thin filaments, actin, and thick filaments, myosin. I know it's a lot at one time. All right, let's see what you think of this, guys. Look back at the slide if you need. Wish I could put that figure up for you, but you just go back to the figure. All right. Okay, good. We have to see people are cooperating. Wow. My goodness gracious, I thought that was tricky, but everybody got it right. Good. Okay, good. Both angles. Maybe you've heard this before. And okay, let's do this one. Oh boy, actually this is, maybe I didn't ask that question. Ooh, that's a little tricky. Okay, let me just go with this here. Okay, the answer I'm looking for, I guess one could make an argument that they run around the thick and thin filaments, but what I'm looking for here is that the important thing for you to remember is that it stores calcium. So the important issue here, I have to, in a sense, I guess I have to show you all the sub-levels of organization. But the action is at those myofibril, the actin and myosin level. That's where the action is. That's where we're going to concentrate. And sarcoplasmic reticulum, which is kind of like the endoplasmic reticulum in other cells, is simply what holds on to calcium. Calcium homeostasis is very important, and you want your intracellular levels of calcium generally to be low. And so when calcium is released, it triggers the cell contraction. So, okay, now that you've had enough torture with new names already, we're going to add one more. And this is very important one, okay? So it's called a sarcomere. So a sarcomere is what, I like the idea of it being called the functional unit of a muscle. You say, well, isn't the functional unit of a muscle a myofiber, that cell? Yeah, but within that is this thing called a sarcomere, okay? So here is the description, okay? You have these overlapping thin filaments and thick filaments that work together. And their appearance is what gives, their appearance under a microscope is what gives rise to the banding. So that banding is more than just there for a way for us to tell what's skeletal muscle and what's not. You can actually explain the banding on a molecular level, and this is how we do it. Okay? You have these thin filaments, thin, right? And then the thick filaments here. Okay, so the three thick ones here are the myosin. You could write next to myosin thick filament. And then we have the actin, which is the thin filament. Okay? And so in one, each one of these thin filaments kind of joins up at the end of this functional unit, which is the sarcomere. Okay? The overall thing is a sarcomere. From here to here is a sarcomere. Okay? So what are some what are some terms that you're going to need to know for the exam? Identify which are the actin, which are the myosin filaments here, and this line here, for obvious because it's kind of wiggle back and forth, is called the Z line, and the Z line defines the edges of the sarcomere, the boundaries of the sarcomere. Okay? I know, it's all very mysterious, my friends, I know. So, what does that have to do with the banding? Well, it really does explain the banding pretty well. Because when you're looking at the banding, now, this is tricky. Remember, the cell is going this way. The myofiber is going across. This is one myofiber, one cell, okay? And within it are multiple sarcomeres. So here's a sarcomere. I could tell that's a sarcomere because it runs from one Z line to the other Z line. And you can see, oh look, the heavy chains, the thick filaments show up as this band. And I'm not going to hold you responsible for the name of each one of these bands. okay, your book does that, but I'm not gonna do it. We're just gonna be able to map that this is represented here, so you have the Z line lines up, and then how the actin filaments line up. The main thing I wanted you to get out of that is there's a relationship between what you see in a microscope and what the molecular structure, okay? By the way, what do you think? Myosin and actin, what kind of molecules are they? Carbohydrates, proteins, or fats? What would you guess? Francesca, what do you think? Proteins, yeah, they're proteins, yeah. You can, unless something has a workhorse function, it's almost certainly a protein. Okay. All right. So, I'm going to get a drink of water. And then we'll do this little bit of sarcomere action. How is it that this sarcomere functions to have a muscle contraction? Okay. It's interesting that fellow teaching next door, I forget what course that is, something in the exercise science realm. And you guys know? What is that course? You know?
Oh, I don't know, but he's an exercise science teacher.
Yeah, but he's basically talking about the same thing, about how muscles work. All right, if you don't mind, let's kind of pick up. Okay, so I used to have a lot of fun doing this with Tommy, but I hope you students are going to work with me, be a little cooperative. I need volunteers. Okay, need like about 10 people. So you guys in front, can you come up? Just come up here. Stand up here. Come up here. No? Well, come on. I need a few people to come up here. Come on. Don't be shy. Don't be shy. Okay. So stand over here. Like I need 4 over here, 4 over here, and 4 over here. Thank you, AJ. Thank you, Chris.
I've embarrassed myself enough
Yeah, there
already.
you go. Okay, come on, guys.
John, get up here. Stay, let's go.
Okay.
This will be interesting.
Yeah, all right. Now I don't want to. Okay. 1, 2, 3, 4. Good. 1, 2, 3. I need one more over here.
Marty,
One more. Okay, good, Marty. Okay. So here's the thing. All right. So that's it. Stay. Just move. All right. This group here move a little bit this way. This group is 4. Move a little bit that way. And this group move a little bit that way. Okay. Good. All right. Now. Would it be too embarrassing to ask you to kind of lock arms and do that, right?
Let's go.
Lock arms? All right. Now, these guys are actin filaments, okay? There are thin filaments, and I'm the myosin, I'm the thick filament, okay? Which is easy to remember, right? Okay, I'm the thick filament. So they're the guy, okay, so at the ends of them is the Z line, right? Would be the Z line. And so there, those 2 actins, I'm going to be the alone myosin. So I'm going to be the myosin there, okay, this guy. And then they're the actins. Okay, now, unfortunately, I only have 1 chain, because there's 1 chain on each side of the myosin, okay? but I'm only showing one side. Now, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to show you how muscle contraction works. So what happens is, you see these what look like oars on the myosin? They look like oars sticking out? They grab on and they pull a little bit together, like that. And then they grab onto the next one and they pull it together. And they grab onto the next one and they pull it together. Okay, very good, thank you. Give me a hand, guys. Extra credit, yeah, right. All right, so what happens is the myosin, I hope you guys can remember this now. Come on, a lot of volunteers for help. All right, so the myosin, right, has these heads that grab on, guys, listen, grab onto the actin and move it one link at a time. They move it's what we call a ratchet mechanism, okay? They're kind of, now the myosin, is the myosin moving? Myosin's standing still. Myosin, are the actins moving? They're coming closer and closer together. So when the muscle is relaxed like up there, the actins are far apart. Then the ratchet starts, okay, and we're going to talk about what kicks this off later, because that's a whole nother deal, what starts the contraction. But once the contraction starts, the myosin pulls it in, pulls it in, pulls it in. It has this binding site to the actin. And so if you see these oars here, the oars are in one configuration, I'd call it open. And then look at over here, they're the opposite. So they went from this way to this way. And then they grab onto the next one, pull it in. Grab onto the next one, pull it in. So that at the end, the overall sarcomere has shortened. The overall sarcomere has shortened because the actins have been pulled closer together through the action of the interaction with myosin. Okay? That's the ratchet mechanism. And I'm telling you, I took a look at the, what's that called? The TCEAF. That's the nerve acetate. And this is on there. Okay? So understanding the concept of a sliding filament mechanism of a muscle contraction. That's how it works. Now, sliding filament, this is just an explanation. And I'm not going to worry about this part right now. Let's not worry about that part. So here's the question. During muscle contraction within a particular sarcomere, which one of these happens? Let's see if we can get it. It's a tough one. Well, you guys are doing great. 15. Oh, such a good demo, huh? Let's see. All right, come on, give it 5 seconds. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, that's it. Cooperating. Okay, what do we got? A couple of D's, but mostly C's. So C is right. Oh, I'm glad you didn't pick A and B. You notice that oh, I'm getting confused myself. Filaments themselves are not changing their shape. They're not. They're just sliding in together. The actins are moving closer through the action of the myosin. Good. Okay. That kind of question you're definitely going to be on the exam. Yeah.
So, like for the myofibrils
Yeah.
are made up of myofilaments.
Yeah.
So are sarcomeres.
No, sarcomeres go around the myofibrils.
Okay.
Yeah, that's really the only reason that we need to break it down to that level, because the sarcomere goes
So
around.
the sarcomere and the myofibrils both have myofilaments?
Well, the myofibril is the unit that contains the myofilament.
Yeah,
And around that whole thing is the sarcoplasmic reticulum.
yeah.
So yeah, you could say that the sarcoplasmic reticulum contains or bounds
Okay.
the myofibril. The
So,
telomeres. It is confusing. It is confusing. I know it's confusing. But listen, don't. Okay. There's a level that is great if you can understand it, and there's a level you need to do well on the exam, and I think in the future. The main thing is recall that there's a thing in the muscle cells called the sarcoplasmic reticulum. Even if you can't really quite understand where it goes, it's responsible for holding on to the calcium. That's one thing. The other thing is the action occurs at the level of the actin and myosin filaments, okay, and to know how that action works. Okay? I think we're doing pretty good. All right, now there's only one other thing that's a little bit of a complication here. And you might ask yourself, well, why is it that this thing doesn't just start on its own? And because those myofibrils are covered with this sort of break. And the break is called the troponin tropomyosin. I might use either one, complex. So what happens is the actual filament, thick filament, is covered by this stuff so that it can't interact with it. The thin and thick filaments can't interact. I know this is probably now, if you weren't confused by now, this is going to really add to it, but kind of like I was the myosin, the guys were the actin, right? And they can't interact because they've got this wrapping of like an inhibitor. And that inhibitor comes off to kick the cycle on. And we're going to talk about that later, okay? So this is what I want to try to do because we still have time. And I think there's enough new stuff to have to digest. So let's do this. Rather than, I'm going to take this whole excitation contraction stuff and just hold off on it for the next time. All right? So I'm kind of skipping that center block because that's a little tricky. And we're going to jump towards other stuff in this section. Okay? All right, so I moved ahead to the role of nerves. So the main thing here, see, maybe even that's too early. Hold on. Okay, I'm going to move ahead to, okay, I'm going to move ahead to here. Hope I can remember. All right, so where does the energy come from? Again, anytime you have a process that involves movement, okay, there has to be a form of energy, and that form of energy is what's called ATP. ATP, all right? So this slide, I would say you can consider FYI. It's really biochemistry. But I just, again, wanted you to at least, and even if you can't remember everything in the slide, realize that most of our ATP comes from these different sugars. Muscle has its sugar inside of it called glycogen, which breaks down the glucose. We also get glucose from food, and then we have a process by which ATP is generated. Here's the thing. When you lack oxygen, this is the only reason, the main reason I put this up here, is when you lack oxygen, what happens is you end up having one of the intermediates of metabolism, instead of making ATP, it ends up as lactic acid. Anybody ever hear of lactic acid? Guys, you guys in the back there, exercise science, know about them. Lactic acid is considered kind of what makes your muscles feel tired, okay? When you get a buildup of that. So, okay, so this is the where the muscles get their energy from. They get it from the metabolism of sugars, okay? And if there's plenty of oxygen, you can keep going, okay? You're running, as long as you're generating ATP faster than you're using it, no problem. But if you start to run low on oxygen relative to your usage of ATP, then you end up having a problem. So muscle fatigue, inability to contract after long exercise, is generally considered to be due to a buildup of lactic acid, okay? So you could actually take a blood sample and measure lactic acid and get a pretty good idea of just how depleted or how tired the muscle is. Now, here's the other thing I want to kind of go over. Ladies, come on, Carol, listen. Okay, how are muscles innervated on a growth level? Okay, this is really interesting. We have, okay, now it's a little tricky to follow, right? If we have a muscle fiber, and remember, muscle fiber is one cell. It has all that complicated stuff in it, but it's one cell. Okay, if I have a muscle fiber, I don't know how to draw a muscle fiber, but it's a long fiber, okay? It would be innervated by one neuron, okay? One neuron in a muscle fiber. However, a neuron can innervate many muscle cells, okay? So any given cell, if you think about it, it makes sense. Any given cell only has one neuron turning it on or off, or turning it on. But some neurons, these are branches of a neuron, some neurons can fire more than one cell, one myofiber. So here's a picture of that. So here's a nerve fiber, a motor. Motor means that it's involved in an action. Okay, so we have a motor neuron shown in blue, and you can see it innervates this guy, and this guy. Here's another one shown in red. It innervates this guy, and this guy. Okay. These are two motor units. So a motor unit consists of a single neuron, its branches, and all the muscle fibers it stimulates. Okay. So then again, it says here, depending on location, a motor neuron may contain anywhere from 10 muscle fibers to 3,000. They're dispersed, not clustered. So in other words, the motor neuron 1 and motor neuron 2 aren't necessarily, they're certainly not on the same myofibers, but they're dispersed, okay, throughout the muscle. All fibers of a motor unit fire or twitch when that unit is activated, and the total strength of a muscle contraction depends on how many motor units are recruited. This is exactly what the guy next door was talking about. It's fascinating. So let's make sure we understand it. So here's one nerve, and when that nerve fires or says go, and we'll talk about what that means on a detailed basis next class. But when that nerve fires, all the muscles that are in that motor unit fire. They contract. Every sarcomere in that motor fiber, in that muscle fiber contracts. So then how do we go from a fine movement, like doing surgery, okay, from, moving a couch, okay? The way that's done is that only a few neurons are fired from the brain to make those very small movements, and a whole bunch of neurons are fired at the same time in order to get the muscle to act in a strong way. Okay, so it's the number of motor units that are fired. So that there's kind of an all or none thing. I think the important thing to remember is that individual cell, individual myofiber, either goes or it doesn't. It either contracts or it doesn't. It doesn't contract in proportion to the amount of stimulation. It's the number of fibers that are triggered that results in the strength of the contraction. Okay, got it? Boy, we have 15 minutes yet, but I kind of feel like I lost a lot of people. Everybody, you guys okay? I'm gonna, yeah, either we keep going or we just prolong the torture for another day. So let's keep going. The hard stuff is over. Okay, the hard part is over for today. This part is kind of straightforward. So let's go through a few more minutes, right? So we have these things called muscle tone. And so just generally speaking, we have a certain amount of background neurons firing in keeping the motor units going. See, you don't even realize it, right? But you're sitting up, and in order to sit up, you have to have muscles firing. If you were to feel your latissimal dorsal muscles here in the back, you feel like they're somewhat flexed, they're somewhat contracted. That's because we always have this background level, so we have a certain amount of muscle tone. Okay. People who lack that muscle tone have hypotonia or flaccidity. Okay. And excess muscle tone, hypertonia, is really a derangement, not a good thing. I forgot closing my parentheses after rigidity, but that can be manifest as rigidity or spasticity. I cannot find a simple way to differentiate those two terms, so we're going to use them interchangeably here. Okay, you're going to have to wait until you're in some neurology class. But yeah, I think you know intuitively what I mean by spasticity. Basically, someone who wants to make a fine motor movement, and it's done to an excess. And rigidity is, you could think of, okay, Parkinson's is characterized by rigidity. So if you go to a Parkinson's patient who happens to be like this in a moment, and you go to move their arm, say just relax, you can't. It's like causative. That's rigidity. Those spasticity and rigidity are manifestations of the general term hypertonia. Okay? Again, this is kind of just what you might consider miscellaneous, I know, but it's not organized in any particular way, but these are important things to know. Isotonic contractions, I'm sure are, my friends in exercise science are aware of this, isotonic, isometric. I think the easy way to remember isometric would be where you're not moving. Anybody do planks? I'm sure people do planks. It's kind of an isometric. And then isotonic would be where you're actually moving. So that would be like a sit-up or a curl or a bench press or something like that where you're moving. The way I try to remember this, because it is confusing, metric is meter. Metric is distance, okay? No change in distance, okay? So you're putting a resistance on the muscle just to stay in place, okay? That's isometric, and then you have isotonic. So these are terms you should be familiar with. Okay, now, getting back to muscle repair and strengthening, we're back to that simple idea that muscle generally does not replicate, so that if it's injured or it can't just repair itself through replication, okay? So, how do we get muscle growth, muscle strengthening, say, when you have progressive resistance type exercise? Well, the muscle fibers themselves become enlarged, thicker, okay? And that's called hypertrophy, enlargement of existing fibers, muscle fibers. Actually, yeah, I'm not really sure what happens on a micro level, but but it's not an increase in the number of fibers. It's an increase in the strength, if you will, or the thickness of the individual muscle fibers. Okay, and that's stimulated by something called the overload principle, where, what do they say? What's that expression? If it doesn't kill you, it makes you stronger, kind of thing. Right? And it is largely influenced by hormones. So if you're someone who does not have a lot of testosterone floating around, such as females, in general, there's always exceptions, you're not going to get the response, you're not going to get muscle buildup as quickly as someone who has testosterone floating around. Any questions about that? And then you have muscle aging, which is called sarcopenia. Sarcopenia is kind of late in life, muscle breakdown. I'm sure you've seen people who are really old, like 80, 90 years old, and they're just really frail looking and hollowed out, and that's sarcopenia. Process starts around 40, probably even younger, actually. Oh, you could cross out the third thing. Okay. But high protein diet and regular exercise can kind of get around that a little bit. So here's an example. It's kind of interesting, isn't it? That you go from a child to about age 30. Now this is kind of a fictional, a rough estimate. If you go from being a child to about age 30, typically, muscles begin to get stronger and stronger, and then they begin to kind of go the other way. So I guess if you're not taking care of yourself, you're just a regular couch potato. Kind of comes down fairly quickly, like that. Your muscle mass. Who am I thinking of? Come on, who's that old timer football quarterback? Old guy, 45.
Tom Brady?
Tom Brady, goodness gracious, how can anybody forget Tom Brady, right? So Tom Brady, is somehow managing to hang on there, go out a little further. But invariably, here's the thing, invariably, no matter what, he gets older, is going to come down. So if you take care of yourself, you can extend that out quite a way. So for example, I kind of like this, because this is like, let's say, and you guys, I know it's not relevant to you, but if you have parents and grandparents, it matters. So let's say a person here, in what we call a disability threshold, they have to have oxygen, really, a walker, all that sort of thing. Maybe that happens to a person who has, it's what I'm trying to illustrate is actually the density of muscle, the amount of muscle really has a major impact on your health. You wouldn't think so, but it does. So maybe this is 75, 80, where the person who is at that point where they can no longer function independently. They're still alive though, but they can't function independently. Whereas look, a person who takes care of themselves, that's kind of how I'm looking at it, really works out and watches what they eat. Wow, they're still able to take care of themselves maybe until way out there, 90. All right. Okay, the door was done. Hang in there, Tim, hang in there. Okay, let's finish up. Okay, muscular atrophy is just, you probably heard the word atrophy, it's just a wasting away. And there are two ways that can happen, okay? I want you to be aware of this. There are two ways. One way is by not using the muscle. That's the classic couch potato idea, that you're just not using your muscle. Or maybe you're in that outer space and there's no resistance to your muscle action, okay? Not using your muscle, that's disuse atrophy. The other one is denervation atrophy. So let's say somebody has a lesion in a neuron, in a central nervous system, a neuron coming out of the spinal cord. When those are cut, spinal cord neurons, they don't grow back. So, you know, like, anybody remember Steve Reeves? No? Okay. So from there on down, you're paralyzed. Well, let's say those motor neurons that feed the legs are now damaged, right? Kind of like the telephone pole wire being cut, okay? The muscles begin to degenerate. That's called denervation atrophy. Now you might say, hey, Dr. M, that's the same thing. That's because people can't use the muscles, they can't exercise. It sounds to me like it's just disuse atrophy. Okay, maybe, but it's called denervation. Okay? So either because you choose not to use the muscles, or because the nerve supply of the muscles is gone, you're going to get atrophy. All right, I think I'm going to leave it at that. You know.